Hey everyone, welcome. Well, this system definitely has some significant weight to it, much heavier than any of my other worm bins. And last time too, I think we sensed the heaviness of it, and I immediately jumped to the conclusion that it must be overly saturated, just heavy because there's too much moisture in the system. And for a system that's 192 days old at this point, like this system is, keeping things nice and damp is definitely important. It's only towards the end of the system's life cycle when I'm striving to get somewhat drier material, because the drier material is going to help me either sift it more readily than I would if it was damp. It wouldn't go through my sifter if it was too sticky and damp, or possibly utilizing the drying of the material as a catalyst to initiate the migration of the worms out of their environment, such as in a migration or something along those lines. I'm really liking the way stuff looks right underneath a coating of leaves like this, because these sort of leaves will always just get placed into the bin dry, as we will do again today. As you can see, I've got a box of leaves here. So the leaves that we already left out here during the last check-in 2 weeks ago, we'll just be blending these in. And I guess on the topic of blending in leaves, we usually do that in my systems when we take care of the feeding and then work our way to the outer edges of the systems to aerate and blend things together, inspect, whatever. Last week we decided to forego the inspection and tilling of the outer reaches of this system. We just left it, and I would say, after the 14 days that passed since the last check-in, plus whatever interval passed between check-ins previously, we're probably somewhere in the neighborhood of a month or so since we last disturbed the outer edges of this system here. So I'm always curious to see how the stuff is doing, since we didn't really get a peek at it during the last check-in. The last check-in included a feeding which was an assortment of different fruits and veggies, and I had a whole bunch of coffee filters. So I used the coffee filters as little kind of cups almost to throw a handful of food in there, and then we had about 5. Oops, sorry. That's my reminder. I gotta go somewhere soon, so I better get my act together and get this completed. So yeah, okay, here we go. Kind of interesting, right? Because you've created a little container, so to speak, into which the worms are now coming for the food, the coffee filter, and they're clearly still working. I have the scent of citrus. Some orange peel must still be in here. I can see little scraps of other food that they're still working down. But it does seem to me like, for the most part, they've managed to work their way through the majority of what was placed into that particular coffee filter. But don't forget, we've got like 4 or 5 more of these to check out. Not too surprising, 14 days, they're going to be able to do away with a good bit of the stuff that you feed them, but certain food items will take them a bit more time. So I think there was an example of that here. Here's a little piece of banana peel, which they've neatly stripped a lot of the soft stuff off of already, leaving some of the more fibrous material to be worked on still. And wow, okay, I don't know what's going on in this piece here, but or this handful, but we've definitely got ourselves a worm party. And it's always so nice to see a bunch of really shiny, lively worms. And these are just worms that originally lived outside, and I ran them in my outdoor worm bag. I think these might be the worms from Outdoor Worm Bag version 6.0, last year's outdoor worm bag. And they've since been bought indoors, and now they're just part of my wormery farm. Well, that was fun, and these little guys scurried out of view quickly. They're definitely a lively bunch. I had this feeling like we were not even getting to the heart of the matter, because I could sense that there was just like a whole lot more worm action going on here. We were only catching a little glimpse of it. I know these worms probably don't appreciate getting thrown out here on the stage with the bright lights shining on them. So I try not to be too rough with them. I guess in these cases we're exposing them to perhaps a little bit more bright light than they would like, but we're only going to torture them this way for a couple seconds and we'll put them back into their home to continue working on their job for us, eating up their delicious kitchen scraps. Well, that previous handful was loaded with all kinds of stuff for them to climb into and hide under. In this case, there was nothing of that nature nearby, so they just try to use one another as shelter. Whoever's out on the top climbs down underneath the rest of his friends and neighbors and then hides up until someone else from above comes and slithers in underneath him, leaving him or her to eventually get exposed out on the surface again. It's just a big vicious cycle. Alright, so we're definitely encountering some of what I already sensed last time, which was the just the overall fullness of this system. I even included that in the title of last check-ins video to suggest that the systems are starting to feel full. And by full, I'm simply talking about the capacity of the container being approached. Man, this handful feels like it's got a lot of worms in it. But you can see me reluctant to place it down over here on the edge. Oh my goodness. For fear of having it roll over the edge and spill out onto the tabletop. Alright, that was pretty exciting. Almost like a new bin launch, so many worms in that handful. You know, I gotta admit, that was pretty entertaining. But let's get on with feeding these little guys. You can see I've got an assortment of different fruits here for them. There's a peach, there's some pineapple, and some strawberry. And over here we've got some matzos. Oh boy. Lately, people who are regulars on my channel have probably been noticing me kind of going against or not adhering to one of the words of wisdom that I always try to impart on the viewers, which is to take bread type products and make sure that they're completely soaked before you proceed to trying to use them in your worm bin. Otherwise you'll come back at a later point in time and not find something that the worms have enjoyed consuming, but rather you'll be left with probably a big pile of mold, because the only thing that was able to make any use of it was the mold in the system, which is fine. You know, if the mold blooms on something or another that you've fed, eventually the mold itself will become a delicacy for the worms to move in on and enjoy. So either way, it all comes out in the wash, as they say. But in this case, and in the case of a couple of my feedings lately, like yesterday, a really dry bagel went into one of my feedings without me dampening it first. I'm just taking my chances at this point. So perhaps in some future check-ins coming up in the near future, we might start encountering little bits of mold patches in places where I've fed bread type foods without dampening it first, but whatever, I'm okay with that. The feeding we gave them, I got a feeling it's not going to produce any leftovers like last time with those banana peels. All this stuff I believe is going to go quick. Even the pineapple, right? It's citrus. People will warn you, don't feed citrus to your worm bins, and I learned long ago to not listen to anybody and just go by what works and doesn't work for me, because I've never really encountered any issues whatsoever attempting to give citrus to my worm bins. So let's get these little guys covered up, and I'm really contemplating the idea of maybe doing exactly what we did last time. And before we cover up, I've got some coffee here we can include, why not? I have been trying to increase the size of the feedings I've been giving my worm bins, and what do you say we use up a couple paper towels here too. So I'm liking the idea of maybe going a little further than normal for me. this 14 days that passed since the last time we checked in on these little guys just feels like the outer limit. Like, man, how could you go any longer without checking in on them, making sure they're okay? But you go to other worm channels and you see how people are checking in on their systems that they've not peeked in on for sometimes months at a time. So the worms would be just fine without me constantly cruising in to see how they're doing. And I don't know. I've got a feeling if we were to wait more than 14 days between now and the next check-in, these worms would be just fine too. There's all kinds of bedding in here. There's leftover foods from the previous feeding still. There's this feeding that they just got. And I have a feeling most people would agree that they're probably going to be just fine if we were to extend the check-in period. But we'll see, you know. That's really just a goal. It's not my new standard. A lot of times what drives my feeding schedule is just it's just getting a read on how much stuff I've got in my freezer, and maybe more importantly how little room remains next to all the worm food. Because I've definitely got a good bit of stuff in the fridge. So yeah, you are correct. I did follow suit with what we did last time, which was to not disturb the outer edges and leave it be one more round. It'll be really nice to see what it is, what the material down there looks like when we come back here next time, whatever that might be. And wow, okay, what the heck, we'll just give it to him. And you know, this is usually my excuse to bring in my soiled glove and try to scrape off what's adhering to it so that stuff can just remain here in the bin where it belongs, and then we can spread things out. So I think if we had fluffed up the outer edges, then I would definitely be teetering on a bin that's overflowing, which is something I don't want either. So number one is it's going to be kind of interesting to see what the outer limits of this system looks like when we come back in here after 2 feeding intervals of just not disturbing it. Should be nice. And okay, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. It felt like I was in the beginning of identifying 2 things to tie them together into something, but I was distracted just trying to think about what else it is that I might have forgotten. So I always get that weird feeling, but whatever, it is what it is. All right, everyone, that's it for the check-in with these red wigglers who are doing so nice here. And you got to admit, that was a bunch of fun worm spottings we had, pulling up handfuls of the feeding from last time, where all the worms are still kind of contained. Even if they'd had their fill of eating, they just didn't really have a way to get out because they somehow got trapped inside the little cups, the little coffee filters. So that was fun. All right, everyone, that's it for the check-in. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.